I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Jeff Rosen. Jeff is the director of the Higher Learning Commission and has written very widely on all aspects of photography, 19th century photography, and he has just published a new book titled Julia Margaret Cameron's Fancy Subjects, Photographic Allegories of Victorian Identity and Empire, and it's just come out with Manchester University Press. Congratulations. And his talk relates very closely to some of the topics in that book. Welcome, Jeff.
Terrific. Okay, so thank you, Martina. Thank you, John. Thank you to the other organizers of this conference. It's a great pleasure to be here. Over the course of several weeks in July 1868, the celebrated photographer Julia Margaret Cameron created a number of extraordinary photographs of Prince Alamayou, the orphaned and exiled Prince of Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia. The British War of 1868, often called the Abyssinian Campaign, deposed Alamayou, making him not only a refugee, but also dependent upon his conquerors. He was only 6 years old. The two photographs on the screen depict the prince seated on a cushion in Cameron's studio, surrounded by emblems of his regal status. Wearing traditional robes, he twists an elaborate necklace of shells or amulets. A ceremonial shield and lion's mane ornament are propped behind him, traditional emblems of Abyssinian kingship and identity that were taken by the British upon leaving Africa. Cameron produced this photograph in two distinct sizes. On the left is a print of 10 by 12 inches mounted onto a board sized 18 by 23 inches, a format designed for display or exhibition. On the right is a reduced size image of 2.5 by 4 inches, the common carte de visite format. The actual size difference would look something like this. Both prints were equally collectible, but while the larger image was designed for the frame, the small card was printed for mass consumption, intended for the collector's box or the photographic album. Some scholars believe that the carte de visite were produced to generate sales for the larger prints, but it seems clear that each was made for different audiences. Both prints affirmed Britain's benevolence toward its recently conquered foe. As we shall see, magnanimity, the noble expression of generosity, is imbued in Cameron's photographs of the prince. Here are two additional prints from the photo shoot showing Alamayou in close contact with his companion, Captain Speedy. Like Cameron's other allegorical photographs, which she called fancy subjects, these images are hybrid works. They use the camera to ground their subjects in real life and play upon the exoticism of African costumes and props. But they also incorporate the romantic and sentimental tropes of genre painting, the smallness and naivete of the child, the innocent in need of protection, the benevolence of the conqueror. As photographic allegories, these images express sympathy, virtue, and idealism. They become emblems of Britain's altruism toward its empire. At this point, it's useful to summarize Britain's war with Abyssinia, then an independent state, located on the Horn of Africa and not a British colony, in red on the map on the left. The country was led by King Theodore II, a practicing Christian whom the English called Theodore. Around 1865, he conceived of forming an alliance with Britain as a way to hold off Muslim incursions from the Sudan and French influence from Egypt. Britain was equally eager to restrain French colonial expansion and expand trade on the Red Sea. So what went wrong between the two countries? In short, letters between the Abyssinian king and Queen Victoria were lost, and various miscommunications followed. In 1866, King Theodore detained the Queen's envoys as a way to force negotiations, but by 1867, Britain beat the drums for war to liberate the captives and, quote, teach Theodore a lesson. Field Marshal Robert Cornelius Napier, pictured here, made the Abyssinian War a colonial war by using the Indian Army as his invading force. Imagine here the logistics. Shipped over from Bombay, were about 9,000 Indian soldiers and thousands of attendants, cooks, and servants. More than 280 ships were deployed to convey this force, along with 4,000 British soldiers and their attendants, as well as numerous animals, including 44 elephants, 16,000 mules, 5,700 camels, 2,500 horses, and almost 13,000 sheep. Cargo included a railway with 20 miles of track. After landing, the British forces trekked 400 miles into the interior until it reached Magdala, marked with the X, Theodore's stronghold. Here is a print of elephants getting readied for transport in Bombay, and on the right, the British force setting up base camp at the port of Annesley Bay. Napier's assault left King Theodore dead by his own hand, and the Illustrated London News depicted the aftermath along with the burning of Magdala. Upon returning to the coast, it became clear that Theodore's widow and son were vulnerable to the power vacuum that would result once the British left Africa. When Alamayou's mother died unexpectedly, the child came under the care of a mercenary soldier named Captain Speedy. In June 1868, the journal reported that Queen Victoria herself would ensure the boy's protection and that he would be transported to England to receive a British education. It published the first images of Alamayou and Speedy to an international public eager to consume news of the war. Not surprisingly, Speedy and Alamayou were treated as celebrities in Malta when their ship, the HMS Urgent, stopped off briefly there on its way from Alexandria to Plymouth. The island's first photographer, Leandro Preziosi, photographed Prince Alamayou on June 27, 1868. He posed Alamayou first in his traditional clothing, then recostumed the boy in British dress, perching a naval straw hat stamped with the Urgent's name on his knee. In July, Speedy brought Alamayou to the Isle of Wight, where they stayed at his mother-in-law's house in Freshwater, down the road from the Camerons and the Tennysons. After Napier returned to England, he brought Speedy and Alamayou with him to Osborne Palace for an audience with the Queen, who took keen interest in the child. The Illustrated London News reported on these events throughout July and August, continuing the theme of Alamayou's redemption by the British, following every major change in his education and upbringing. Commercial photographers like Jabez Hughes and the London Stereographic Company competed to capture their image, and collectors responded enthusiastically. Here are several cartes de visite depicting Speedy and Alamayou together, and another set of the young prince depicted alone. It is in this context that Speedy and Alamayou entered Cameron's studio, that is, as celebrities. But Cameron was less dazzled by fame as is now imagined, and more inclined instead to use her African subjects to construct a visual narrative. Toward that end, she developed several strategies of representation. The first is connected to England's self-described civilizing mission, seen in these two images, the left showing the prince grasping his necklace, the right showing him holding a white fabric doll on a miniature lace-covered bed. Here, the doll works with a little boy to emphasize his immaturity. In her book, On Longing, Susan Stewart associates dolls with a hierarchy of social status, writing that dolls and the dollhouses to which they are attached represents, quote, extravagant displays of upper-class ways of life that were meant to stop time and present the illusion of a perfectly complete and hermetic world, unquote. In short, the perfect doll on its ornate bed turns real life into a kind of still life. By extension, the prince is arrested in time, ready to be improved by British civilization. Cameron's second strategy was to emphasize the prince's small size through miniaturization. This is expressed by his recessive posture and passivity. The diminutive, writes Stewart, is a term of manipulation and control as much as it is a term of endearment. Cameron's approach reinforces several symbolic transformations as a result. For one, the child's innocence is emphasized, and because he is surrounded by artifacts of royalty that he cannot claim, his powerlessness is underscored. Let me back up these assertions by showing how Cameron typically portrayed male children as weak. On the left is the turtle doves of 1864, which represents sacrificial offerings in the Bible. In the center is the water babies of the same year, depicting helpless children cut off from society. And on the right is young Astyanax of 1866, of course Hector's son from the Iliad, the first innocent casualty of the Trojan War. What evidence do we have that Cameron understood her portrayal of Alamayou in this way? For one, we have Cameron's creation of miniature albums. On the left, for example, is one of Cameron's photographs that portray Alamayou and Speedy together, and on the right, an album page that she created for the Norman family, containing a tiny circular image of the print that has been cut out from the center of the larger print. As you see on the right, Cameron paired this tiny print together on the page with another of her docile childhood groups. Like the reduced size of the doll and the album, miniature paintings and the carte de visite format also reify this powerlessness. In 1868, Queen Victoria commissioned the artist Reginald Easton to paint a miniature portrait of the child. The painting is sized 3 by 3 3/4 inches, about the same size as a carte de visite. First made popular in the 16th century, painted miniatures like this allowed owners to imagine the face of the other as if it were independent of the actual individual depicted. As a private image, miniatures were concealed in a special cabinet or a locket, freezing their subjects outside of time and place and history. And there's some wonderful examples of miniatures up on the 4th floor in a cabinet, happily. Cameron's third strategy was allegory, where she could create a new reality, represent psychological anxiety, or embed social instability, because in allegories, multiple points of view are represented easily. For example, Cameron reenacted the Abyssinian War in her studio, producing the image on the left, which she titled Spear or Spare. In the photograph, she arranged Captain Speedy to stand in for the victorious British and posed Alamayou's attendant, whom Virginia Woolf identified as Casa, to represent the Abyssinian king. Cameron clearly drew upon popular culture, like this contemporary cartoon on the right that appeared in the journal Punch. Spear or Spare wholly embraces the drawing's hostility. The helmeted Britannia juts a spear at the horrid-looking caricature of the African king and threatens, "Now then, King Theodore, how about those prisoners?" Just as Speedy restrains his vulnerable prisoner and points his spear at his captive's exposed throat. Nothing here is left to chance, it must be said, because the role of allegory is to create a complex narrative structure. As Craig Owens insisted, in allegory, the subject poses as an object in order to be a subject. But this photograph also expresses Cameron's ambivalence, as it remains unsettled in the image whether Speedy should kill or save his captive. Cameron's apparent impasse reflects the nation's ambivalence toward Abyssinia in the aftermath of the war, as the British public began to debate whether the venture was worth the extreme cost it took to prosecute, or an imperial folly. The photograph might also reflect her own view about benevolence, since her title, Spear or Spare, expresses a military decision, while it also poses a moral question. The morality of colonialism was also important to Queen Victoria. After dissolving the East India Company and establishing British rule in India, she wrote of her desire to express what she called, quote, feelings of generosity, benevolence, and religious toleration toward her colonial subjects. To capture this idea in visual terms, she commissioned Thomas Jones Barker in 1861 to portray her in the act of presenting a Bible to an African prince. Barker called his painting The Secret of England's Greatness. Although it was not exhibited until 1863, the painting became known widely through the reproductive engravings made in 1864 by William Henry Symonds and published by the Print Sellers Association. And although the scene represented here never actually took place, the artist's use of the Bible aptly describes how Britain used religion, symbolically and in practice, to justify its control over other human beings. Importantly, the painting also expresses Britain's self-image of its own greatness in secular terms. That is, by representing imperial rule as a relationship between the empire and its colonial subjects. It is this same impulse that led Cameron to pose her Abyssinian subjects in a similar way, especially in this untitled photograph of Speedy, the Prince, and Casa. On the one hand, the image shares many formal elements with Spear or Spare, including Speedy's extended arm touching Casa. Both men wear the same costumes, but here the little boy is present, sheltered by Speedy's embrace. As the detail shows, Speedy's left arm is exposed, revealing an elephant tattoo at the visual center of the photograph. Roland Barthes might have identified this emblem of military power as the punctum of the photograph. After Barker's painting gained popularity as a mezzotint engraving, Cameron turned her photograph of the Abyssinians into a carte de visite. Because both images are linked together as expressions of magnanimity, that is, generosity toward the defeated and the dependent, it is with these two prints that I conclude. In Barker's picture, the African's ceremonial costume expresses the trappings of power. These are equivalent to the symbolic value of Alamayou's necklace and royal shield in Cameron's photograph. But as David Cannadine has shown, ornaments of kingship like these, no matter how precious or esteemed, are ephemeral and empty. Their symbolic value is exaggerated because their real power has been neutralized. By contrast, the emblems of British power represented in each print express the true power dynamic that sustains the imperial relationship. For Barker, the Bible symbolizes Britain's moral authority. For Cameron, Speedy's elephant tattoo represents its military might. Each artist has placed these symbols at the center of their respective compositions. In both images, then, emblems of power are softened by gestures of benevolence. Physical dependency is normalized under imperial rule, and domination and brute power is made presentable by magnanimity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I was really struck by what you said about sort of the loss of power and the rendering impotent of the accoutrements of the child prince, and I was struck by the strange sort of elision between the clothing and those accoutrements that the child is surrounded with, which are native, presumably, to his culture. And then the dressing up in costumes and theatrical dress. There's this strange blurring of this clothing that is foreign, but it's not foreign to the child. And it just made me think about your, in trying to interpret what is happening in these pictures and that stripping of the power of these accessories. And I thought that, miniaturization is one thing, but there's that strange use of costume, I think, is another, and the kind of Britishization, just to come back to a conference topic, of this complete displacement of the child, and rendering as part of this allegorical theatrical project. So I just wondered if that was part of the thinking. Maybe that's so totally obvious, but...
Well, there's several elements of what you said that I think are important. For one, to get back to the British costume, Preziosi, when he set up Prince Alamayou in British dress, for the before and after, it's almost like a Barnadoe, Thomas John Barnadoe, before and after for the little scamp who's turned into an industrious worker, as an analogy. That the Britishness is carried forward. And so Alamayou is photographed yearly until he dies at the age of, as a teenager, 17, 18, 19, it's really not clear. And in British dress to sustain that he's made this transformation. At one point, Queen Victoria gives him a locket, a pocket watch rather, and the photographs show him with Victoria's presents. But the other side of what you're talking about too is the spoils of war. All of these costumes, the artifacts, ended up in British collections. When the British left Africa, the British Museum, the British Library obtained manuscripts. Napier, before he burned Magdala, made it really clear that they were to strip the churches of artifacts, and then they auctioned off the king's blood-soaked garments. So this was absolutely taken back to England as as emblems, concrete and symbolic of the victorious war. So these emblems, the South at Kensington Museum, now V&A, has shield and lion mane ornament.
Thank you. Jeff, just looking at this photograph as you were speaking, I wondered whether you could say more about the ways in which the photograph particularly structures relationships of intimacy. And there's something for me, particularly in this image, about touch and the charge of a desire of looking, this kind of network of touch between the bodies, one fist clenched and then the other reaching out, this arm encircling these bodies, and that very intimate gesture of touching his cheek, and then this network of gazes. I mean, there's an incredible charge from those eyes of Speedy down through his arm, and I just wondered whether you could say whether that's something, and especially when we're looking at this in relationship to the painting as well, the ways in which the photographic structures these desires for intimacy.
Sure, I think the intimacy of this photograph is very different from Spear or Spare, which is all about hostility and aggression with the spear point in the throat. And you're right, this photograph is very much about intimacy and protectiveness. Speedy is Queen Victoria interceded into Alamayou's life by making Speedy his protector. So as Speedy, who has been with him since the war and into the future, he becomes Alamayou's guardian. And when Captain Speedy is transferred to a British post in Calcutta, the boy goes along with him and is in Calcutta with Speedy for 2 years before coming back to be educated in a British public school. So the intimacy there is reinforced, I think. And so what is unclear, though, is this costume Captain Speedy, who is quite strange and not really well conveyed in black and white photography. He was apparently 6'5". He had bright orange hair and a bright orange beard, and of course he was multilingual. He at one point prior to the British campaign was in the service of King Theodore himself, and at various points was a British spy and a kind of double agent. So his relationship to this is a refugee from a country that has been defeated, where its capital has been razed, and all of the treasures of the capital have been looted. The British used 2 elephants and 200 mules to sack Magdala and cart off all the treasures. Gold, Renaissance paintings, there's at least one Renaissance painting, and manuscripts, all that had important identity for the country of Abyssinia. With respect to the topic of this machine of British or fostering British identity, I think this gesture also solidifies it. It's British power that has subjugated the black African on the right. and that's emblemized by the tattoo emblem. Think of bringing Indian elephants to Africa as war elephants, essentially. And at the same time, sheltering one of its native sons, the prince.
Yeah, it's just a quick, I think the detail that I remember is that Theodore shot himself with a revolver given to him by Queen Victoria.
Yes.
Which
yes.
shows the
Yes.
gifts that were given could have
Yes.
unfortunate consequences. But also, I wanted to ask you, and you just came to it at the end of your last answer about this tattoo. Because I think you're absolutely right that this is the punctum, this is a fascinating thing, but I think it's an incredibly unstable and complex symbol, because after all, until the kind of hipster moment, tattoos were a symbol of alterity. I mean, this is the working class sailor rather than the imperial, administrator. And this man is a kind of figure of liminal, a figure who doesn't really belong in the hierarchies of the British Empire. So it seems to me that unstable, also the symbol of the elephant can just as well be a symbol of anti-imperial, of the Mughal India as it would be of British India. It's a symbol of working class identity. It's a symbol of a kind of free figure who moves between empires and across boundaries. So I think this tall cross-dressing man is a very unstable figure of British imperial power, and indeed, he may be enormous and orange, but he's also quite feminized by all this velvet. So there's a kind of unstable gender identity there too, as well as political and class status. So he's a fascinating figure, but maybe not a representative of empire in the way that, some of the figures that Cameron portrayed honorifically, such as Governor Eyre.
I couldn't agree more, yes. And I do go into that in a longer version of this, but you're absolutely right on both accounts. The instability of Speedy, who's not immediately recognized as British, and then the instability of this African tattoo, which, and here's one of the unfortunate elements of old photography. As you see in the carte de visite, it's totally bleached out and unreadable as an elephant tattoo, and there are only several images of those that I've seen where it's really quite apparent what it is. And I've tried to research the history of British military tattoos, and of course these were for many years embarked upon by soldiers and sailors in particular. There's a long tradition. What seemed to be unique, at least for the British military naval tattoos that I've looked at, is that elephants don't appear. This is a particular use of elephants as war animals, which of course goes back to Hannibal and probably beyond, but still it's just a fascinating 19th century element here. And you imagine the British with their advanced weaponry, they brought the Sevastopol, the enormous mortar that they used in the Crimean War, with them to Abyssinia. So there's this is extraordinary if you know these objects.
Yes, I don't think Speedy is an exceptional figure, because he reminds me of T.E. Lawrence, the idea of exotic drag, and that somehow you are involved in this transaction with a different symbolic order of things, and your exoticism is the passport, as it was for T.E. Lawrence. Mm-hmm. And again, you intervene in foreign lands with imperial purpose, and you are this movable, erratic figure, as Lawrence was. Yeah, just an observation.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks.